The wind didn't howl that night. It whispered, as if ashamed to touch the bones of the living. A half-moon hung above the forest, pale and thin as an old scar. The trees stood naked and brittle, their branches clawing at the night. Snow clung in ragged patches between beds of dead leaves, and on a low branch a torn scrap of cloth fluttered like a forgotten flag. Somewhere far off, smoke drifted from a fire too distant to reach. It sent faint, a cruel reminder of warmth denied. In the hollow of a fallen tree, she lay curled tight, a shadow within shadows. Her bare feet were blotched with the cruel frost blue. Her hands clenched to her chest, as though holding on to her own heart. Dirt streaked her face, her lips split and raw. She held a crust of bread so hard and stale it could have been carved from stone, her fingers trembling around it. Above her, a crow hunched on a bare limb, head cocked, eyes black and patient. The snow told its own story. Boot prints led away from her shelter, deep, heavy ones, careless in their stride. One set was small, a child's, pressed faintly into the earth before vanishing into the underbrush. The ground between the prints bore the scuffed shape of a dropped sack, and near it lay a coil of rope, frayed at one end, stiff with cold. It rested in the snow like a dead snake, and the marks it left told of something tied, then untied in haste. The crow ruffled its wings, but it wasn't the first to notice the sound. Somewhere beyond the treeline, a horse's breath puffed into the cold, steady as the rise and fall of the earth itself. The crunch of hooves broke the night's stillness, slow and deliberate. A figure emerged from between the trees, horse steaming beneath him. He swung a leg over and dismounted, the leather creak of his saddle sharp in the silence. His boots pressed into the snow without hurry. A coat collar was turned high against his jaw, a brim pulled low over his eyes, and the long shadow of a rifle rested easy on his back. He took in the hollow, the shape of her, the sharp bite of the wind. His gaze shifted to the boot prints, following them with the care of a man who understood that stories often began with tracks in the snow. He stopped beside her. For a moment he didn't speak. His gloved hand hovered above her shoulder, still as a prayer unspoken. She stirred at the shift in shadow, eyes flickering open. When she saw him, her body jerked in the smallest flinch, one born of instinct, not thought. The man lowered himself to one knee, moving with the kind of quiet you'd expect from someone who had learned long ago that noise could get you killed. Slowly, he shrugged his coat from his shoulders. The air caught the heat, still clinging to it. Without a word, he bent and wrapped it around her, tucking it in at the sides so it held against her body. Her breath hitched. The crust of bread dropped from her fingers into the snow with a soft thud. She didn't reach for it. She drew herself deeper into the coat's folds, her small frame swallowed by the heavy fabric. The smell of leather and wood smoke clung to it, and she pressed her face into that warmth as if afraid it might vanish. He studied her for a moment longer, his jaw tight against whatever thought pressed behind his eyes. Then, low enough for the words to belong to the night alone, he said, "You're safe now." Somewhere above them, the crow launched into the air, black wings cutting the pale light as it vanished into the dark beyond the treeline. The wind followed, carrying with it the faintest lift of hope. He lifted her as though she might splinter in his arms, setting her sideways on the horse's back. The coat wrapped around her hid almost all of her but the faint outline of her face, pale and still. He swung up behind her, one arm anchoring her in place, the other holding the reins loose, but steady. Snow thickened as they moved, the flakes drifting down like ash from a long-dead fire. She didn't speak, and he didn't ask. The rhythm of the horse was slow, unhurried, each step chosen with care on the frozen ground. Before long, her head settled against his chest, her breathing deepening. The rise and fall of her frame softened into sleep. The trail narrowed at a creek, its thin ice crusted over, dark water moving slow beneath. He dismounted first, the snow crunching beneath his boots, and reached for her. She tried to put her feet in the stirrup, but hissed softly, pain flashing across her face. He saw the mottled blue at her toes, the skin cracked where the cold had bitten too deep. When his hand steadied her wrist, the sleeve slipped back, and a scar caught the light, raw and ridged, circling bone like a permanent shackle. She pulled the sleeve down quick, but not before he'd seen it. He said nothing, only lifted her gently to the ground and led the horse across. They rode on until the trees thinned into a wide sweep of land where winter had gnawed the earth bare. The sky felt larger here, emptier. Off to their left, half buried in frost and shadow, lay the bones of an old battlefield, tumbled wagon wheels, splintered wood. A saber rusted into the side of a tree, like a wound that never closed. His eyes lingered there, the lines of his face hardening. He tightened his grip on the reins until the leather creaked. When they stopped for a rest, she noticed the faint drag in his step, the way he favored one leg, though he tried to hide it. By mid-afternoon, the outline of a small town emerged through the haze. The buildings huddled together against the wind, their windows reflecting only cold light. He drew rein before a general store, dismounted, and helped her down. Her small feet touched the boards of the porch like she expected them to splinter beneath her. Inside, the air was warmer, carrying the smell of flour, lamp oil, and dust. People stared. A woman by the counter leaned toward her companion and whispered behind her hand. A man stacking sacks of grain glanced at the girl and muttered, low but not low enough, "That one should have been left for the wolves." The words dropped heavy in the room. The stranger's head turned toward the voice, his gaze flat and steady, but he didn't speak. The man looked away first. At the counter, he asked for boots, bread, and a wool blanket. The storekeep brought them without question, though his eyes kept drifting toward the girl. She stood near the doorway, shoulders drawn tight, watching him count the last of his coins into the merchant's palm. Outside, on the porch, she pulled the boots on awkwardly, her toes curling into the coarse wool socks. He handed her the bread, and she ate in small bites, pausing often to glance around, as if expecting someone to appear and snatch it away. They didn't stay in town. The sun was low, the air turning sharper by the minute. He rode them out into the open plain until a shallow draw offered some shelter from the wind. He built a small fire, the flames licking up through the dry sticks with a brittle crackle. She sat close, the coat still wrapped around her, the boots on her feet like they'd been there forever. The light from the flames carved his face into planes and shadows. He stared into it as though it might speak. Her voice broke the quiet for the first time since they'd left the forest. "Why'd you stop?" It was barely more than a breath, the question carrying the weight of disbelief rather than curiosity. He didn't answer right away. The fire popped, and a curl of smoke wound upward into the dark. When he spoke, it was slow, as if testing the words before setting them free. Because they didn't. The flames sank into embers, their glow softening to a dull red. She pulled the new blanket around herself, tucking it beneath her chin, holding it close like a shield against the cold and whatever memories chased her through it. He leaned back on his hands, eyes on the last flicker of light, as the night closed over them both. The settlement was little more than a cluster of buildings pressed close against the wind, their roofs sagging under the weight of old winters. Split-rail fences marked the edges like brittle ribs, enclosing frost-burned yards and barns leaning into the cold. As they rode in, the girl's body stiffened against him. Her eyes moved quick over every face that turned to watch them, searching for something, or someone, and finding only stares that didn't soften. A rangy dog slunk from the shadows of a porch, hackles rising. It gave a low growl as they passed, teeth bared just enough to glint. He eased his horse onward without slowing, but her fingers clenched tighter in the coat's folds. He left her outside the saloon, tethered the horse, and stepped in for supplies. The air inside was thick with smoke and the sour tang of spilled whiskey. Men hunched over their drinks, voices low until one carried just far enough to reach him. "Cost too much to feed," someone said, followed by a laugh that cracked the air. Never did know her place. Some folk just aren't worth the bread they chew. The laugh was joined by another, uglier one, and a chair scraped back. He didn't turn toward them, just took his coffee in silence, staring at the warped wood of the bar. But the word stayed, heavy as a nail driven slow. When he stepped back into the street, she was waiting by the horse, small and quiet, her breath turning to fog in the cold. They rode on without speaking. The church stood at the far edge of town, its steeple thin and sharp against the sky. Inside, The air was warmer but smelled faintly of mildew and wax. The priest, a narrow man with soft hands, looked the girl over with an expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We can find her a place," he said, voice measured, almost rehearsed. "Somewhere she'll be taken care of." The pause before the last words was enough. He gave a small shake of his head, said only, "No," and turned to leave. The priest didn't press him, just watched them go with a faint, unreadable smile. They camped that night in the lee of a barn, a fire throwing small shadows into the frost. She sat on the ground, knees drawn up beneath the blanket, staring into the flames. When she spoke, her voice was flat, the words heavy, but without the tremor of grief. "They were my family. My pa owed them, and I worked it off. When it was done, they didn't want me there no more. Just told me to go. Took me past the river and left me. Didn't even wait for me to walk away." He didn't answer. She didn't look at him when she finished, just pulled the blanket tighter and leaned back against the barn wall. The fire cracked once, loud in the stillness, and neither of them spoke again before sleep. Morning came gray and slow. He saddled the horse, while she sat alone on the church steps, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on nothing. She looked smaller than she had the day before, the way she held herself as if braced against a blow. He mounted, turned the horse toward the road out of town. The wind bit hard at his face, but it wasn't the cold that made him stop. He looked back. She was still there, still and silent, the same shadow of a crow clinging to her as the night he found her. Something in it, something in her refusal to move, rooted him to the spot. He swung the horse around. The farm sat a mile past the last fence line, its yard bare but for a few stunted trees and the skeleton of a plow half buried in snow. He dismounted at the gate, the boards creaking under his weight. The man who came out to meet him had a face lined more from spite than age. The stranger reached into his coat, took out a pouch, and tossed it into the snow at the man's boots. "This debt's done," he said. The man bent, scooping the coins into his palm, his mouth curling. "You didn't owe me a thing." "No," the stranger said, resting his rifle across the fence rail. His tone was light, but the weight of the gun made it clear enough. The man's smirk faltered. He stepped back. The stranger gave him one last look, turned, and walked back to his horse. Snow had begun to fall, the flakes slow and heavy. When he reached the church again, she was still on the steps, but her head lifted at the sound of hooves. He dismounted, held out his hand without speaking. She rose, the blanket still around her shoulders, and stepped toward him. Together they walked into the white, the town falling away behind them. No one followed. The cabin appeared out of the trees, like something the woods had been keeping for itself. A low roof under a skin of snow, walls weathered gray, smoke curling from the chimney in a slow, uncertain question. Pines crowded close on all sides, their needles dark against the white ground, the air holding that deep, resinous scent only winter could sharpen. He pushed the door open, letting her step in first. The warmth was modest but immediate, built from a small fire burning in the stone hearth. Inside was simple, one table with two mismatched chairs, a narrow bed against the far wall, and a rifle hanging above the door, polished and well-kept. The floor creaked underfoot, but the space felt solid, a place that had stood quietly against more winters than either of them could count. He set his coat back on her shoulders, though the air here was gentler, and moved to the hearth. From a pot hanging over the fire, the scent of stew began to bloom, meat, carrots, potatoes, their edges soft from hours of slow simmer. She sat at the table, hands folded, watching him work as if unsure what to do with her stillness. When he set the bowl in front of her, she hesitated only a moment before picking up the spoon. She ate slow, as though committing each bite to memory. Between spoonfuls, she glanced at him, then back at the food, her gaze flicking to the door as if to reassure herself no one would take it away. He noticed, but he didn't speak. When the bowl was empty, she set the spoon down with a soft clink. The fire popped in quiet. She lifted her eyes to him and said her name, her voice quiet but certain. He repeated it, letting the syllables roll over his tongue, as though tasting something rare. Then he gave her his own, simple and unadorned, but carrying a weight he had not placed in another's hands for some time. She stayed by the fire after the meal, wrapped still in his coat, her legs curled beneath her. The flames lit the edges of her hair and cast her face in a soft glow, the kind that belonged to places where the world couldn't easily intrude. He stepped outside, the cold catching in his lungs, his breath hanging in the air. The night was quiet except for the slow, distant groan of the pines in the wind. He split a log with 2 steady swings, the sound sharp against the hush. For a moment, he stood still, letting the quiet settle over him before carrying the wood inside. She had fallen asleep in the chair, head resting against the back, the coat drawn close around her. There was a faint smile on her lips, so small it might have been mist in the firelight. On the table beside her hand lay a crust of bread, untouched. Outside, the wind moved softly through the pines, but tonight it carried no shame.